My name is Kara L. Harrison, 25 years old. He didn't even let me finish the sentence. I was halfway down on one knee when Ethan exhaled, slow and irritated, and said, "I'm not ready. If you can't wait, marry someone else." Not crying, not shocked, just annoyed, like I'd asked him to help me move on a Sunday. We'd been together almost 3 years, living together for one, and before anyone asks, yes, marriage was discussed, repeatedly. Casually at first, then more seriously over the last 6 months. He knew this wasn't coming out of nowhere. We were in our apartment, the one we split rent on, the one he calls our home when it's convenient and my place when he's mad. I didn't plan anything dramatic. No restaurant, no crowd, just a quiet night in. Takeout on the counter. His favorite show paused on the TV. He always said he hated public proposals, said they felt performative. Apparently private ones do too. I stayed there for a second with the ring box open, feeling exposed in a way I wasn't prepared for. He didn't look at the ring. He looked at me like I'd misread the room. "I love you," he added quickly, like a disclaimer. "But I'm not there, and I don't want to feel pressured." Pressured. 3 years. Shared bills. Shared furniture. Shared future talk. But this was pressure. I stood up slowly and closed the ring box. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I said I loved him too, but I wasn't going to beg or compete for commitment. He scoffed. Actually scoffed. He asked why I was being so dramatic and said he was just being honest, like honesty excused the damage. That was the moment something shifted. Not when he said no, but when he assumed I'd stay anyway. Like this was a delay, not a decision. Like I'd nod, put the ring away, and wait in line behind some imaginary finish line he controlled. I slid the ring into my pocket and said, "Okay." He frowned and asked what I meant. I repeated it. Then I said we were done. His face changed. Not hurt, not sad, confused, like this wasn't how the script was supposed to go. He laughed, short and sharp, like I'd threatened to quit my job after a bad day. He told me to stop, said I was being ridiculous. I stayed standing, which seemed to irritate him more than anything I'd said. I told him he'd been the one to say I should marry someone else if I couldn't wait. I was just taking him seriously. He rolled his eyes and grabbed his phone, accused me of turning everything into an ultimatum. That word again. Ultimatum. Like I'd cornered him instead of asking a question I'd earned the right to ask. I reminded him calmly that he'd been the one sending me engagement rings as jokes, the one talking about weddings like abstract ideas until suddenly they weren't. He waved me off and said that didn't mean he agreed to anything. He said he was only 25 and still wanted to live life, like commitment meant death. I asked him what he was waiting for, a job milestone, a certain age, a feeling. He shrugged and said he'd know when he knew. That answer hurt more than the rejection, because it meant there was no finish line, no shared direction, just me standing still while he decided when or if I was enough. When I told him I wasn't asking him to rush, just to choose, his tone changed. He asked why I needed a ring so badly, said maybe it was an ego thing, like I needed to lock him down before he realized he could do better. Something went quiet inside me then. Not anger, detachment. I told him I didn't need to lock him down. I needed to know I wasn't waiting in line. He stood up, said he couldn't believe I was throwing everything away over this. I looked around the apartment, all our shared stuff, all the half-finished plans, and told him I wasn't throwing anything away. I was just not pretending anymore. He shook his head and said I'd calm down and we'd talk tomorrow. That assumption, that I'd shrink overnight and come back compliant, told me everything. I grabbed my jacket and said there was nothing left to talk about. He didn't follow me. He thought I was bluffing. He was wrong. I didn't go far that night. I drove until my hands stopped shaking, then slept on a friend's couch. The next morning my phone was full. Not apologies, instructions. "We need to talk. Don't be immature. You scared me last night." That one almost made me laugh. Scared him by taking him at his word. I replied with one sentence. I meant what I said. I'm done. And for the first time since I bought that ring, the weight in my chest lifted instead of deepened. I slept on my friend Nina's couch that night. The kind of couch that smells like laundry detergent and old books, the kind that makes you feel 14 again. She didn't ask questions. She just handed me a blanket and said, "You good?" I said yes, and for the first time since I bought the ring, it wasn't a lie. I fell asleep fast, not because I wasn't hurting, but because my body finally stopped bracing for the next dismissal. By morning, my phone was a mess. Not apologies, not questions, instructions. "We need to talk tonight. Don't be immature. You really scared me last night." That one almost made me laugh, scared him by taking him at his word. I replied with one sentence. I meant what I said. I'm done. His response came immediately, all caps, no punctuation discipline. What do you mean, done? I didn't answer. Panic shifts tone quickly when control slips. By noon, the rewrite began. I never said we were breaking up. You're twisting my words. Why are you doing this to us? There it was, the attempt to soften the moment now that consequences existed, to turn a clean sentence into a misunderstanding. While I was at work, he went back to the apartment. He texted me a photo of the ring box sitting on the coffee table. You forgot this. I hadn't forgotten. I left it there on purpose. When I got home that evening, he was sitting on the couch like he still belonged there, shoes off, hoodie on, posture familiar and territorial. He asked if I was done proving my point. I stood by the door and told him I didn't propose to make a point. He scoffed and asked if I proposed to pressure him. I shook my head and said I proposed because I knew what I wanted. He crossed his arms and said he didn't, and that shouldn't end everything. But it does, I said quietly, because I'm not waiting indefinitely while you decide. He snapped then, said, real love waits. I realized something painful and clarifying at the same time. He didn't want time. He wanted control over it. I picked up the ring box, slid it into my jacket, and told him I hoped he found what he was ready for. He looked offended, not sad. He said I was making a huge mistake. I nodded and said I knew. Then I walked out again, this time for good. The next few days felt unreal, like the relationship was still happening somewhere else, and I'd stepped out of frame. I went back once while he was at work to grab clothes, my laptop, the things I'd need short term. I left the furniture, the mugs we picked together, the framed quote he liked. I wasn't trying to punish him. I just didn't want reasons to come back. That night, the calls started. Not from him, from his sister first, then a cousin, then an unknown number. I didn't answer. Finally, he called from his mom's phone. I answered because I knew it wouldn't stop otherwise. What did you do? He demanded. No hello, no softness, straight to accusation. I told him I ended the relationship. He said I embarrassed him. I told him I proposed. He said no and told me to marry someone else if I couldn't wait. He scoffed and said that wasn't what he meant. But it was what he said. He went quiet for a second, then asked if I was really just done. I said yes. He asked if I didn't even want to talk it through. I said we did talk, and he was clear. His voice turned sharp then, bitter. You know my parents thought you were serious. They thought you were mature. I told him I was serious. That's why I wasn't staying. He hung up on me. 2 hours later, his mom called. I didn't answer. The next morning, his dad left a long voicemail about how I blindsided Ethan, about patience, about how real commitment means waiting without pressure. I listened to it sitting on the edge of Nina's bed, feeling strangely calm. They were furious because they thought I'd break, because everyone assumed I'd wait quietly while their son decided if I was worth choosing. I deleted the voicemail. By the end of the day, mutual friends started texting. She's really hurting. She didn't mean it like that. You know how he is. Yeah, I did. That was the problem. One friend told me Ethan was saying I pressured him with the proposal, that he'd felt cornered, that he'd been honest, and I punished him by leaving. Punished. Like he was owed continued access no matter what he chose. 3 days after I moved out, he sent an email. Long, emotional, carefully worded. He said he was shocked I'd thrown everything away so fast, that he thought I loved him enough to wait. He said he didn't understand why marriage had to be now and why I couldn't trust his timeline. He never said he was sorry, not once. He framed it like a misunderstanding we were both responsible for, like my response was disproportionate. I typed a response and deleted it. Typed another and deleted that too. Eventually, I sent one sentence. I didn't leave because you said no. I left because you told me to marry someone else. He replied 5 minutes later. That was a joke. I stared at the screen, realizing how differently we experienced reality. How something that cut me cleanly in half could be dismissed as careless wording once it stopped working in his favor. I didn't reply. That night, Nina asked if I was okay. I told her the truth. I was sad, but I wasn't confused anymore. And clarity hurts less than hope that keeps getting postponed. He didn't reject marriage. He rejected choosing me while still expecting me to stay. And I wasn't built for that kind of limbo. I thought the silence would do its job after that. That time and distance would soften the edges and let everything settle into something quiet and final. I was wrong. 2 days later, he showed up at my work. Not inside, thankfully, but waiting across the street when I walked out, arms crossed, sunglasses on, like he'd rehearsed the scene in his head. "Can we talk?" he asked, already irritated that I hadn't smiled. I almost said no. Almost. Curiosity won. We sat on a bench where people passed without looking twice. Public, neutral. He started immediately. Said he didn't understand why I was acting like this was some huge betrayal. I told him I wasn't acting. I was responding. He scoffed and reminded me I was 25, that people wait, that you don't blow up a relationship because someone isn't ready on your schedule. I asked him if there was ever a schedule, an age, a year, anything concrete. He hesitated, then snapped back that guarantees were unattractive. That word did something to me, like he was grading my worth based on how little I asked for. I told him I didn't need guarantees. I needed intention. He rolled his eyes and said I sounded like a podcast. Then he leaned in and tried a different angle, said his parents loved me, and asked if I really wanted to be the girl who walked away because she couldn't wait. I stood up. I told him I was the girl who walked away because she wasn't chosen. He said I was twisting everything. I said I was finally seeing it clearly. He laughed bitterly and said I'd regret this. I shrugged and told him maybe, but I wouldn't regret respecting myself. He warned me not to expect him to explain things to people for me. I smiled and said I didn't. Then I walked away while he was still talking. That should have been the end. It wasn't. 2 days later, my phone started buzzing from numbers I didn't recognize. I ignored the first few, then a voicemail slipped through. His mom. Angry, loud, not even pretending to be calm. She accused me of humiliating him, of stringing him along, of proposing when I clearly knew he wasn't ready, which was news to me, considering he'd spent the last year talking about marriage like a hypothetical he expected to step into eventually. An hour later, his dad called with the same message in a different tone, said I disrespected their family, said real commitment meant patience, not walking away when things got uncomfortable. Not one of them mentioned him telling me to marry someone else. By that evening, extended family had opinions too. A cousin I'd met twice messaged me saying I'd broken his heart. Someone else asked why I'd propose if I was just going to leave. That one almost got me, because it made me realize how the story was being told. In their version, he was a confused man who needed time. I was the dramatic woman who couldn't handle hearing no. There was no room in that story for his tone or the eye roll or the assumption I'd stay anyway. I didn't correct anyone, not because I couldn't, but because I didn't need to. Late that night, he texted me from a new number. You didn't have to let this get so ugly. I stared at the screen, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I replied with one line. I didn't make it ugly. I just didn't stay quiet. He didn't respond. But I knew then this wasn't about love anymore. It was about reputation. And the fact that his family was furious told me everything I needed to know. They weren't upset he wasn't ready. They were upset I didn't wait around anyway. The silence after that text didn't last long. It just changed shape. He stopped calling, stopped showing up, stopped trying to corner me in person, and let his family do the talking instead. It was almost impressive how quickly the responsibility shifted away from him and landed squarely on me, like I was the unstable variable that needed correcting. The first warning came from a mutual friend who texted me, cautiously, like she was approaching a wild animal. Hey, just a heads up. Ethan's parents are really upset. Upset didn't begin to cover it. Apparently, they'd been telling anyone who would listen that I'd blindsided their son, that I'd let him believe everything was fine and then walked away over nothing. Over nothing. Like 3 years of shared life and a proposal meant to be a phase I'd grown bored of. 2 days later, his aunt left me a voicemail. I'd spoken to her maybe 3 times in my life, all of them polite, surface-level interactions at holidays. Her voice was sharp and disappointed, like I'd failed an exam she'd never told me I was taking. She said I'd broken Ethan's heart, that young women like me always ran the second things got serious, that I needed to grow up. I listened to the entire message without interrupting, without clenching my jaw, without that familiar urge to explain myself. When it ended, I deleted it. What struck me wasn't the anger, it was the assumption. Every message carried the same underlying belief. I was supposed to stay. I was supposed to wait, quietly, indefinitely. The fury only made sense if they all assumed my role was to hold space while he decided when or if I was worth choosing. The idea that I might leave on my own terms hadn't even crossed their minds. That night, Ethan texted again, from another new number. I never wanted my family dragged into this, he wrote. You could have just waited. There it was, the core belief laid bare. I replied once, calmly. I didn't drag anyone in. Waiting only works when there's something you're waiting toward. He responded with the familiar pivot. So 3 years meant nothing to you? I stared at that sentence longer than I expected to. Then I typed the truth. It meant enough for me to ask and enough to walk away when the answer was clear. He didn't reply after that, but the story kept circulating without him. People stopped asking me how I was and started asking why I'd done it, why I couldn't just be patient, why I'd turned something private into drama by leaving. I didn't argue. I didn't correct the narrative. I let it burn itself out. The noise belonged to people who weren't in the relationship and didn't have to live with its consequences. By the end of the week, the calls slowed. The messages stopped. The outrage fizzled once everyone realized I wasn't coming back to negotiate or explain myself into a smaller shape. I moved into a smaller place closer to work, bare walls, borrowed furniture, quiet nights. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and it felt like breathing after being underwater too long. What stayed with me was the clarity. He hadn't rejected marriage. He'd rejected choosing me while still wanting me to stay. His family wasn't angry because he wasn't ready. They were angry because I didn't wait around anyway. And once I saw that, there was nothing left to argue about. Once the calls stopped, the quiet settled in for real. Not the anxious kind where you're waiting for the next interruption, but the kind that gives you room to hear your own thoughts again. I unpacked slowly in the new place, stacking clothes in drawers that didn't carry memories, setting my laptop on a desk that hadn't witnessed any arguments. There was relief in the blankness. No shared furniture to negotiate. No half-finished plans staring back at me like obligations I'd failed to meet. I replayed the moment on one knee more times than I want to admit, not because I regretted asking, but because I finally understood what I'd been waiting for all along. It wasn't a ring. It wasn't a timeline. It was intention. The willingness to choose a direction together instead of asking one person to stand still while the other decided if the view was good enough. People kept telling me I was brave. Others told me I was impulsive. A few said I'd overreacted. What none of them understood was that staying would have been the real risk. Staying would have taught me to accept being optional. Staying would have turned waiting into a lifestyle. Walking away didn't make me fearless. It made me honest. Ethan reached out one last time, weeks later, a short message that tried to sound reflective without actually owning anything. He said he hoped I was well, and that maybe one day we could talk without all the tension. I wished him well and didn't invite the conversation. Closure isn't something someone else hands you. It's something you decide you're done chasing. I started noticing how different my days felt without the constant negotiation. I made plans without checking if they conflicted with someone else's uncertainty. I said yes to things because I wanted to, not because I was proving I was easy to be with. The absence of waiting changed everything. It made space for calm, for clarity, for a version of myself that didn't need to audition for commitment. Looking back, the proposal didn't end my relationship. It revealed it. The sentence that followed, the one about marrying someone else if I couldn't wait, was the truest thing he said that night. He meant it as dismissal. I took it as information. I didn't leave because he wasn't ready. I left because he assumed I'd stay anyway. I left because love that only moves on one person's timeline isn't partnership, it's limbo, and I'm not built for that. If there's anything I'd tell someone standing where I stood, ring in hand and hope in their throat, it's this. Asking for clarity isn't pressure. Wanting intention isn't insecurity. And walking away when you're not chosen isn't failure. It's self-respect.